Welcome to the debate. If you want to govern a society effectively, what works better? Is it the threat of a bloody execution or the total removal of guilt?
Wow, right to the heavy stuff.
Always. Because today we are examining a really fundamental tension that emerges from biblical texts and ancient history. We're asking which system was functionally more effective in governing human behavior and bridging the gap between humanity and the divine? Was it the strict, highly structured Old Testament law, or the internalized, permanent framework of New Testament grace?
Yeah, and this is an incredibly complex structural question. We are grounding this analysis in some pretty extensive source material today. Specifically, we're examining the Epistle to the Hebrews, Levitical practices, and historical documentation from biblical, ancient Near Eastern, and modern scholarship.
Right.
We'll be looking really closely at the work of scholars like Scott Hahn and George E. Mendenhall, just to understand how these systems actually operated in real time.
Exactly. So to lay out where I stand, I will be taking the position that New Testament grace is operationally superior because it fundamentally transforms the human conscience, shifting behavioral governance from external threats to internal identity, and providing permanent, direct access to the divine.
Okay. And I will be representing the position that the Old Testament law was frankly a masterclass in behavioral economics and societal ordering. It utilized these visceral, socio-liturgical frameworks and tangible physical anchors that successfully regulated ancient societal and spiritual boundaries.
Okay, well, let's get right to the metric of success then. When we look at the Old Testament law, and specifically I'm talking about the entire Levitical sacrificial system, we have to evaluate its functional ability to achieve its ultimate stated goal.
Which you would say is what?
Perfecting the human conscience. And by its own admission, it failed at that. I mean, the writer of Hebrews is explicit about this in chapter 7, verses 18 and 19.
Right, the weak and useless passage.
Exactly. The text literally states that the former regulation was set aside because it was weak and useless. It made nothing perfect. We are talking about millions of animal sacrifices performed by an endless procession of, well, imperfect Levitical priests year after year.
Yeah.
But see, you're judging.
The text explicitly calls these sacrifices an annual reminder of sins. I mean, think about it. If your regulatory framework requires a person to constantly slaughter an animal to symbolize their guilt, you are not removing a guilty conscience. You are systematically reinforcing it.
But see, you're judging.
Wait, just to finish the thought. On the alternative, New Testament grace provides the ultimate operational solution because it completely shifts the regulatory framework. Relying on the once-for-all sacrifice of Jesus Christ, it moves from behavioral modification via external rules to an internal transformation. Like Jeremiah 31 prophesied, the law is written directly on the human heart and mind. You no longer need the external threat of punishment because the internal desire to transgress has been eradicated.
Okay, but you're judging the Old Testament law by its ability to grant internal moral perfection. And honestly, that is a category error.
A category error? How so?
It's like criticizing an MRI machine because it didn't cure your cancer.
Oh, interesting.
Right? Its functional purpose was purely diagnostic. It was designed to highlight the lethal boundaries of the disease, not to heal it. Pragmatically speaking, the Old Covenant was a highly effective system designed to order a chaotic society. It vividly communicated the severe cost of transgression in a language ancient people actually understood.
But did they need all that blood?
Yes. Look at the modern scholarship, specifically George E. Mendenhall's groundbreaking work. He compares the Sinai Covenant to Hittite vassal treaties. The Old Testament covenant perfectly mapped onto the legal and geopolitical realities of the late Bronze Age.
So it was just a product of its time?
No, it was God speaking their language. He didn't invent a new abstract religious language. He used the international legal vernacular of the time, the suzerain vassal treaty. Look, humans are physical beings, right? And physical beings require physical anchors.
I don't disagree with that in theory.
Well, those tangible rituals, the bisection of animals, the strict physical layout of the tabernacle, the visceral sensory overload of the sacrificial system, they provided a psychological effectiveness that purely abstract spiritual concepts of grace absolutely failed to achieve. The law wasn't trying to make you feel internally warm and fuzzy. It was keeping an ancient society from tearing itself apart in the unmediated presence of a holy God.
Okay, but you're evaluating behavioral economics purely through the lens of terror.
I wouldn't call it terror.
What else would you call it? Let's look at the actual psychological fallout of those physical anchors you just praised. Take the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. You mentioned sensory overload. The text describes a bull, a ram, 7 male lambs, and a goat all being slaughtered.
Right. It's a very specific liturgical requirement.
It is a slaughterhouse. Blood is being spilled everywhere to demonstrate the costliness of sin. The high priest enters the most holy place, and the people are left entirely on the outside. They are waiting in absolute silence, gripped by terror, asking themselves, will it work?
That's a bit dramatic, isn't it?
Is it? They are literally wondering, is God going to accept this, or is the priest going to drop dead behind that thick curtain? Building a relationship with the divine or even a stable society on a foundation of sheer terror is disastrous compared to the full assurance of faith brought by the new covenant.
Well,
I submit that if a system requires you to repeat a terrifying, bloody ritual year after year, day after day, that repetition inherently proves the system is broken and failing. It's a temporary patch on a leaking tire.
See, you call it as a temporary patch. I call it brilliant psychological reinforcement. You are severely underestimating the human capacity for amnesia.
Amnesia?
Yes, we are incredibly forgetful creatures. We need physical milestones. We need undeniable proof of our standing. To counter your claim that the people were just left in sheer terror, let's look at the historical Jewish traditions recorded in the Mishnah and the Talmud regarding the Day of Atonement.
Okay.
They detail an incredible practice that emerged. The high priest would take a red cord, a crimson ribbon, and tie one part around the horns of the scapegoat, the goat designated to carry the sins of the people into the wilderness.
Right, the Azazel goat.
Exactly. And he would tie another red cord to the massive doors of the temple. The tradition states that when the ritual was accepted and God forgave their sins, that scarlet thread above the temple doors would miraculously turn white.
Drawing from Isaiah, right?
Yes, Isaiah 1:18. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Think about the behavioral psychology of that specific moment. The people aren't just left with an abstract theological concept of forgiveness.
No, they get a sign.
Right. They don't just have a preacher telling them they are internally clean. They get an immediate, undeniable visual confirmation of relief. Human psychology heavily relies on that kind of tangible milestone to process guilt and experience genuine closure. The repetition of the ritual wasn't a glitch. It was a necessary feature designed specifically for human nature.
Okay, but relying on a visual gimmick still proves the internal conscience wasn't wiped clean.
Gimmick is a strong word.
Well, it provided a temporary, cyclical dopamine hit of relief, but it wasn't permanent. And let's look at the physical architecture attached to that visual. You mentioned the temple doors. Let's examine the structural axis of this relationship.
Okay, let's look at the temple.
The Old Testament system was entirely defined by exclusionary concentric circles of marginalization. You had the court of the Gentiles on the far outside. Moving inward, you have the court of the women, then the court of the Israelites, then the court of the priests, then the holy place.
creating appropriate boundaries.
Creating barriers. And finally, behind a heavy, woven veil, the most holy place, where only the high priest could go, and only once a year. The entire system was deliberately engineered to keep people at a distance. It practically shouted, "You are fundamentally unworthy to come near."
Well, they were.
Sure, but contrast this mechanism with Christ's Melchizedekian priesthood in the New Covenant. Hebrews 7 makes a brilliant, deeply technical legal argument here. The Levitical system had a built-in obsolescence. The priests kept dying.
Right. Mortality is a problem for a permanent priesthood.
Exactly. A system run by mortal administrators is fundamentally flawed because it constantly requires replacement. Jesus isn't from the tribe of Levi. He's from Judah. He hacks the legal system by operating under an older, superior precedent, the Order of Melchizedek.
Which the text says is based on an indestructible life.
Yes, because his life does not end, his priesthood does not end, his perfect, once-for-all sacrifice completely tears down that dividing veil. Under the new covenant, the architecture of exclusion is destroyed. When our high priest exits the temple, the doors don't close behind him. The access is permanent, unlimited, and direct.
See, you're treating the temple like a modern, inclusive community center.
No,
You are.
And it wasn't. It was a cosmic courtroom, and we completely misunderstand this access if we don't look at how ancient covenants actually functioned. I flatly reject the idea that strict exclusionary boundaries were a design flaw.
But they kept people away from God.
That hierarchical separation was an absolute necessity for survival. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 10 reminds us that God, by the very nature of his existence as holy, pure, and a consuming fire, cannot be in casual fellowship with corruption.
Right, I'm not denying holiness.
But treating the divine as common or assuming unrestricted access invariably breeds contempt and moral laxity. When there are no physical boundaries, human beings lose their reverence for life and law. Look at what the source material states. Under Moses' law, those who despised it died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses.
Which is horrific.
Modern listeners hear that and recoil. It sounds brutal, but it maintained rigorous societal order. It created an appropriate life-saving awe. I argue that our modern interpretations of grace have severely diluted this exact concept into cheap permissiveness.
Ooh, cheap grace. The classic argument.
It's true, though. We think unlimited access is a virtue. But without the physical walls, without the courts keeping us at an appropriate safe distance, we forget the lethal gravity of what we are dealing with. The physical boundaries mapped directly onto spiritual realities that kept the community morally and physically intact.
Okay, but a reverence born entirely from the threat of instant execution is just compliance. It isn't transformation, it is hostage behavior.
Hostage behavior?
Yes, obey me or die. But your mention of the courtroom brings us directly into the deepest legal layer of this debate. If we're evaluating the operational success of these covenants, we really have to look at the legal framework they utilized.
We do. And this is where the modern division between law and liturgy completely fails us. We put the courtroom in one building and the church in another, but in the ancient Near East, they were indistinguishable.
Right.
Scott Hahn's historical work on Hebrews chapter 9 absolutely destroys the modern assumptions about this text. For centuries, Western scholars have translated the Greek word diatheke in Hebrews 9:16 and 17 as a Greco-Roman last will and testament.
Yeah, the classic translation.
Right. The argument goes that a will only takes effect when the person who wrote it dies, so Jesus had to die to activate the will. But Hahn shows this is historically and legally inaccurate.
Because Hellenistic wills didn't work that way.
Exactly. They did not require death to be legally valid. They were valid the moment they were notarized, and estates were often distributed while the person was still alive.
So the traditional translation as a last will and testament obscures the actual mechanism at play. I mean, it softens the violence of what is actually happening.
Spot on. Hahn argues convincingly that diatheke must be understood as an ancient Near Eastern covenant, and establishing these specific covenants required a drah retitus, a curse of death ritual.
Right, this is where it gets really intense.
It does. He cites the ancient 8th century treaty of Ashranir Riari V and Madi Iliu, the king of Arpad. Modern listeners find this primitive, but it was their constitutional law. In this treaty, a spring lamb is brought out and its head is violently torn off.
Wow.
And the oath spoken over the animal is literal. It says, "This head is not the head of a lamb. It is the head of Madi Iliu. If Madi Iliu sins against this treaty, so may, just as the head of the spring lamb is torn off, the head of Madi Iliu be torn off."
So it's a self-maledictory oath.
Exactly. You are calling down a lethal curse upon yourself if you break the law. When Moses sprinkles the blood on the Israelites at Sinai in Exodus 24, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant," they are engaging in a drohoredes.
Right.
The physical sacrifice of those animals wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was a highly effective, legally binding deterrent. As this blood is spilled, so may my blood be spilled if I break this covenant. Tying the law to a vivid liturgical curse of death is the ultimate way to govern human behavior. It ensures compliance through the strongest possible instinct, self-preservation.
Okay, I fully acknowledge the historical brilliance of the drohoredes framework. It is a stunning piece of socio-legal engineering. But your entire argument hinges on the idea that this deterrent actually worked.
Well, it ordered society.
Did it?
I have to challenge this premise entirely. What happens when that brilliantly engineered covenant is immediately broken?
Well,
Let's look at the historical record you were pulling from. Israel swore that self-maledictory oath in Exodus 24. They let the blood of the Drothritis hit their skin, and then, less than 40 days later, what do?
they build the golden calf.
They build the golden calf, a legal deterrent that fails to deter the very people who just swore to it, literally weeks after they swore it, is an operational failure of epic proportions.
I wouldn't call it a failure of the system, though. I'd call it a failure of the subjects. The legal framework functioned exactly as it was designed to.
But a system is only as functionally effective as its ability to govern its subjects. If we follow Hahn's logic and the ancient Near Eastern legal realities you've just established, breaking that self-maledictory oath meant the covenant maker Israel had to die immediately.
Right, the curse was activated.
The Drothritis demanded their total execution. The head of the lamb was torn off, therefore their heads had to be torn off. Yet they didn't die.
Well, Moses interceded.
Exactly. Moses points out in Exodus 32 that God suspends the execution based on a prior oath he made to Abraham centuries earlier, swearing by himself to bless Abraham's descendants. Think about the implications of this. The Old Testament law, this terrifying blood-soaked deterrent that you claim is a masterclass in behavioral economics, was functionally broken from the very start.
That's a strong way to put it.
But it had to be held in abeyance. It was completely reliant in God's prior grace, just to not wipe the nation out on day 40. Doesn't that prove that a system relying on external threats of death is vastly inferior to a system that rewrites the internal code of the human being?
Okay, but
Let me just land this. Christ, acting as the corporate representative of humanity, ultimately takes that curse of death upon himself. He absorbs the broken Drothritis. He fulfills the legal requirement of the execution, allowing for a new covenant where the law is put into our minds and written on our hearts. Fixing the human heart so it actually wants to obey is infinitely more effective than continually threatening to cut off the human head.
Okay, look, I can see that the internal transformation promised by the New Covenant is the ultimate theological resolution. I mean, the text demands that. But you cannot dismiss the fact that the Old Covenant strictures were an absolute prerequisite to diagnose the depth of the human problem.
Returning to the MRI analogy,
Yes, the fact that the patient smoked cigarettes immediately after getting the MRI doesn't mean the MRI failed. Without the Drothritis, without the terrifying bisection of the animals, without the heavy veil and the concentric circles explicitly keeping people out, humanity would never have understood the sheer, unapproachable severity of divine holiness.
I hear that.
The law, with all its visceral terror and legal liturgical brilliance, made the sickness of the human will visible. It utilized behavioral psychology, restricted physical space, and ancient constitutional oaths to govern a civilization in its infancy. Even if Christ's internalized grace is the final answer, he is answering a question that was articulated with absolute precision by the Old Testament law.
That's totally fair. I appreciate the distinction between diagnosing a disease and curing it. It really brings us to a crucial synthesis regarding the source material here. Throughout this entire debate, whether we are examining the architecture of the tabernacle, the Levitical priesthood, or the ancient treaties of Ashur-Neri 5, a shared truth emerges.
Which is?
That human beings are inextricably physical and spiritual. We are not pure intellect and we are not merely animals.
Yes, and the writer of Hebrews makes this very clear. The text repeatedly emphasizes that physical blood alone cannot change spiritual realities. It explicitly states it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to actually take away sins.
Right.
The mechanics of animal sacrifice lack the moral will to affect genuine spiritual change. But conversely, a purely abstract spiritual philosophy isn't enough to ground humanity in space and time. The ultimate solution had to successfully marry the two realms.
Precisely. The material makes clear that the perfect sacrifice required both a physical reality and a perfect spiritual will. The New Testament argues that Jesus Christ didn't just offer a spiritual philosophy, he offered a physical body, literal flesh and blood, inside of history, mirroring the physical anchors of the Old Testament.
but with a different outcome.
Exactly. What made it functionally effective wasn't just the physical death, it was the perfect, obedient will behind it. He bridged the gap between matter and spirit, fulfilling the external legal demands while securing the internal transformation.
And yet, we are left with this fascinating paradox in the modern era.
How so?
Well, as much as we celebrate the internalized grace of the new covenant, human nature still constantly craves the tangible architecture of the old covenant. I mean, we still build massive exclusionary cathedrals. We still perform highly choreographed physical rituals.
We love our ceremonies.
We do. We do. We still desperately seek visible milestones, whether religious or secular, to process our internal guilt and spiritual states. The historical and theological layers of these biblical covenants offer endless depth for us to explore, precisely because they perfectly mirror the unresolved complexity of the human condition. We are caught between the need for boundaries and the desire for freedom.
Wow, that is perhaps the most profound takeaway for our listeners today. We tend to think of the Old Testament system as primitive history, but if you look around, modern secular society still operates almost entirely on the Old Testament model.
Oh, absolutely.
We use external threats, prisons, fines, lawsuits, public shaming, and cancel culture to enforce boundaries because, as a society, we do not possess a mechanism to fundamentally change the internal human will. We manage the fallout of transgression because we cannot eliminate the desire to transgress.
Right.
In that light, grace isn't just a religious concept. It is the only truly disruptive social technology ever proposed, because it is the only system that claims to rewrite the source code of human desire. The transition from the Old Covenant to the New is a profound commentary on how human beings are best governed, healed, and brought into contact with reality. Is it through the rigorous, awe-inspiring structure of the law, or the radical internal freedom of grace?
The material leaves us to weigh the undeniable brilliance of the ancient socio-liturgical framework against the unprecedented power of a permanently cleared conscience. Both systems expose profound truths about what it takes to manage the human animal.
And so we leave that judgment to you, the listener. As you think about these ancient structures and the mechanisms of human behavior, consider the architecture of your own life. Do you require the heavy closing doors and the threat of the Drophartus to understand the gravity of your actions? Or can you live transformed, knowing that when our high priest exits the temple, the doors don't close behind him? Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time on The Debate.